egg tarts, lion dances, Chinatown. These are the symbols often associated with Chinese Americans. As one of the largest ethnic groups in the U.S., their contributions have shaped the nation's rich immigrant identity. Yet behind the vibrant colors and the celebrated cuisine lies a history of exclusion, a community built out of rejection, surviving and thriving despite having their very livelihoods infringed upon. A community that decided to take responsibility to fight for their rights. Through decades of resistance to discrimination, over 10,000 court cases were filed by the Chinese. Cases like these established landmark decisions responsible for protecting immigrant rights, setting the precedent for American values.
What most Americans believe in today, the rights that they have, were won by the Chinese.
The Chinese didn't come to America intending to make history in court. They came as entrepreneurs, businessmen seeking prosperity. Most settled in San Francisco, the closest U.S. city to the Chinese port of Hong Kong. From 1850 to 1860, the Chinese population in California surged from 660 to nearly 35,000. Although over a third would return home, the Chinese population in the West would become an ever-increasing point of conflict. As the Chinese built towns and livelihoods, discontent over job competition grew amongst native-born Americans and other immigrants, particularly the Irish. As the first major immigrant population, the Irish had dominated labor jobs but demanded higher wages and better conditions. Employers prioritizing cost-cutting replaced them with Chinese workers who accepted lower wages, furthering resentment. Then the panic of 1873 hit. Speculation in the stock market flew into a frenzy, leaving the economy in ruin and thousands of workers laid off. As cheap laborers, immigrants were able to keep their jobs, worsening tensions. As one of the largest ethnic groups in California, the Chinese became the area's scapegoats for economic hardship. Strikes and violent attacks began between laborers, high tempers escalating into conflict that left the Chinese displaced and sometimes killed. One of the worst was the Rock Springs Massacre of 1883, which left dozens of Chinese dead and hundreds driven out. Blinded by hardship, many saw the Chinese as a threat that needed to be pushed out. But the Chinese had long been preparing to resist, not through violence, but through unity and law. Unlike other immigrant communities, the Chinese developed a vast network of organizations.
We have about 300 organizations to help the 15,000 Chinese. Who has so many organizations?
These groups, initially for economic cooperation, evolved into defensive institutions as anti-immigrant sentiments escalated. Some of these, like the Samyup, Siyup, Ningyuan, Yangmo, Hopwo, and Hipkat, consolidated into the Chinese Benevolent Association, later the Chinese Six Companies. Underground groups like the Tongs also emerged, protecting communities from external threats. With the arrival of the Chinese driven out from other regions, a resilient community formed in San Francisco, prepared to defend its rights. In 1880, San Francisco passed an ordinance requiring laundromats and wooden buildings to obtain a permit, citing fire hazards. However, out of the 310 laundries, only 100 received permits. The rest, all Chinese-owned, were denied.
So right away the Chinese says, this is obvious. They're trying to get rid of us. So they hired the best lawyer money could buy. They went and raised the money, $20,000. $20,000 they raised is equivalent to $500,000 today.
Li Yik, a laundry owner, volunteered to operate without a permit, was arrested and refused to pay the fine. Alongside attorney Hall McAllister, funded by the people, he sued against the officer who arrested him in Yik-Wo versus Hopkins, arguing that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause applied to all, not just citizens, and couldn't be denied based on factors such as race. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor, affirming that laws must be enforced equally and agreeing to their interpretation of the amendment, a precedent that would protect all minorities. Near the same time as Yik-Wo versus Hopkins was making its way to court, another case unfolded in San Francisco. In 1885, Joseph and Mary Tape sued Spring Valley Primary School for refusing their daughter Mommy Tape admission. They argued that as taxpayers, their daughter was entitled to public education under the 14th Amendment. Backed by their organizations and community under the same restrictions, the Tape family sued against the school's principal in Tape versus Hurley. The California Superior Court ruled in their favor, but instead of allowing Mommy to enroll, San Francisco hastily created separate schools for Chinese children, cementing one of the first separate but equal education in America. Against her mother's wishes, Mommy Tape became one of the first students in segregated Chinese schools. It seems no matter how a Chinese may live and dress, Mary Tape wrote, as long as you know they are Chinese, they are hated as one. There is not any right or justice for them. Between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Chinese immigrants filed over 10,000 cases, 30 of which reached the Supreme Court. Many targeted the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which stripped rights from Chinese immigrants, including travel and citizenship. This meant that immigrants could not visit family outside of the U.S. without risking their entry back into their homes. One of the most significant cases against this act was United States versus Wong Kim Ark, 1898. Born in America, Wong Kim Ark was denied re-entry after a trip to China because of the Exclusion Act's enactment just as he was returning. Backed by influential attorneys funded by the Chinese six companies, Wong Kim Ark versus U.S. was taken to the Supreme Court, arguing that the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. The court ruled in his favor, establishing birthright citizenship as a fundamental American right.
The Chinese were not cheap. They hired the best, most influential. And the Chinese want, once and for all, you're born here, you're American.
These cases didn't just protect Chinese rights, they became the foundation of America's civil rights. 10 years later, Yik Wo versus Hopkins would serve as a precedent and reasoning against discriminatory institutions and policies in Plessy versus Ferguson, stating that the case was held to be an attempt to make an unjust discrimination against the Chinese race. While this was the case of a municipal ordinance, a like principle has been held to acts of state legislature passed in the exercise of police power. Even though separate but equal would be upheld, the earlier decision from a fight for immigrant laundries became responsible for upholding the right for equality across America. It would be used alongside Tate versus Hurley and Gong Lum versus Bryce to pave the way for Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, permanently ending segregation in schools and giving both immigrant and black families the right to fair education refused 6 decades prior. And in 1898, Wong Kim Ark versus United States would establish birthright citizenship, securing American identity for millions. But there are more. A wrongfully convicted man forced to admit a false confession. Zhang Shuang versus United States in 1942 ruled that confessions obtained through coercion were inadmissible, later forming the basis for Miranda rights now utilized daily in America's public safety. Schools were free, but immigrants couldn't understand English. Lau versus Nichols in 1974 required schools to provide bilingual education for non-English speakers, ensuring people the right to understandable educational access. Invasive security screening, migrant working rights. The decisions made from these cases are responsible for what we know as America's rights. These cases define American freedoms, yet few recognize their Chinese origins.
We paid for it. People went to jail. And we don't tell the story.
Chinese Americans have long been excluded from the recognition they deserve for the responsibility in shaping the values America claims to uphold. These communities weren't built for leisure. They were forced by necessity, forced to rely on each other when society rejected them. But these so-called discarded people didn't just survive. They changed America. Their battles for simple rights showed the land of the free where it really lacked. Fundamental rights for everyone. Education. Equality under the law. America celebrates its achievements. After all, we are the land of the free. But does it celebrate those who fought for them? And if not, aren't we still discarding the very Americans who built this country's legacy, after even a century? America loves success stories, but it cherry picks whose stories to tell. Chinese Americans remain in the shadows, behind a mask of stereotype, despite shaping the nation's core values, whether through thriving businesses, Miranda rights, or birthright citizenship.
The court cases gave Americans these rights that lasted. So, don't tell us to go back to where we came from, where we gave you all these rights. If you think about it, the core beliefs and values we have in this country